The first bullet missed us, the second one didn't. It slammed into the ground right beside Salim's foot. No warning, no voice, no other hunters. Just someone out there, watching us, aiming, and pulling the trigger, like we were animals. We thought it was a mistake, until we learned the truth years later. He wasn't hunting deer that day. He was hunting us. I worked as an environmental protection officer in a remote mountainous region in northern Canada about 8 years ago. I chose the job out of a genuine passion for nature, but there's a side of it that almost no one talks about, a side that is heavy, dark, and leave a lasting impact on the mind. Our duties were not limited to monitoring wildlife or regulating hunting. We were also responsible for investigating incidents that occurred deep within those vast forests, cases that often seemed ordinary on the surface, yet sometimes concealed something far more difficult to explain. Over the years, I handled many reports, bear attacks, missing hunters, injuries caused by human error. But there is one incident in particular that still stays with me to this day. It happened about 5 years ago. We received a report from the local police about a strange hunting accident near a remote valley known as Valley of Silence. Even the name alone gave an unsettling feeling, but it was more than just a name. According to the report, 2 hunters had been tracking a large elk since dawn. They noticed something unusual about the animal. It was moving slowly, hesitantly, almost as if it wasn't aware of their presence despite being so close. Eventually, they got their chance. One of them fired. The elk dropped immediately. Everything seemed normal up to that point, but instead of approaching right away, they decided to wait. Usually the correct choice. Wounded animals can sometimes go into shock before suddenly getting back up. Minutes passed slowly. 10 minutes, 20, then 30. The hunters finally moved in cautiously. They stood over the body, observing it, confirming there was no breathing. Everything indicated the animal was dead. One of them knelt down, preparing to take a photo. And in that exact moment, something impossible happened. The elk, completely motionless for half an hour, suddenly snapped upright, as if it had never been hit at all, and charged directly at the kneeling man. It wasn't random movement. It was a direct, violent attack. Its antlers drove into his body with tremendous force, throwing him to the ground before he could react. The second hunter tried to fire again, but everything happened too fast. The shot missed, and the animal simply vanished. Yes, vanished. It ran into the forest as if it had never been injured. The injured man was airlifted out and survived by sheer luck, despite his severe wounds. We were dispatched to the site that same day. I still remember the feeling when we arrived. The area was disturbingly quiet. No birds, no movement, just a heavy silence covering everything. We began the search. We followed blood trails. We searched in every direction. Hours passed with nothing. We found no body, not even a clear sign that a fatal wound had ever occurred. And that was impossible. The medical report confirmed the bullet had struck a vital area, an injury no animal should have survived, let alone run with. But the reality was right in front of us. No body, no evidence, no explanation. As time went on, the confusion turned into something worse, something closer to fear. The question was no longer, where did the animal go? It became, how did it stand up at all? After the investigation, we were asked to write a report with safety recommendations. I sat in front of the paper for hours, but I wrote nothing. What could you possibly say about something like that? The hunters followed every rule. They waited. They checked. They acted cautiously. And still, one of them almost died. In the end, there was no logical explanation. Only questions. Questions without answers. And even now, whenever I remember that incident, I can't shake the feeling that something in that forest was never natural at all. My name is Adrian, from the city of Salzburg here in Austria, and I believe I carry within my memory a story that may deeply captivate your attention. This is not merely a frightening experience I personally lived through, but rather a deeply personal story tied to my roots, and yet it evokes an indescribable sense of dread in me every time its memory surfaces. My Arabic expression may feel somewhat limited at times, and for that I ask for your understanding. However, I assure you that everything will become clear as you read further, and your time will not be wasted. My grandfather, Sebastian, was born in 1899. He spent his early years between school and hard labor on my great-grandfather's vineyard estate. He dreamed of attending a prestigious university to become a surgeon, but the First World War shattered countless dreams, including his. He was too young to serve in that war, but shortly before the outbreak of the Second World War, he volunteered as a junior officer. However, the rapid German advance into Austria broke his unit apart, forcing him to flee across the Swiss border into Britain, where he joined the Austrian Free Forces in exile. His life's dream was to march with the army that would liberate his homeland, but the exile command had different plans for him. He was assigned to a strategic mission in the high mountains of Tibet. Despite Austria being under occupation, some diplomatic and military missions in Asia still operated under the authority of the Austrian government in exile. They urgently needed skilled men to manage logistics and mountain routes, and my grandfather was chosen for that role. He traveled to Tibet in 1940 and spent 5 full years living in the cold, thin air of the highlands. When the war finally ended and he was expected to return home, he shocked everyone by refusing to come back. He claimed he had not only found a place to live, but a new life, one that offered prosperity and purpose, as a mountain expedition guide and hunting expert. His base was in a remote settlement called Lessa, located in the heart of an eastern plateau, surrounded by eternal snow peaks and towering pine forests. Wealthy Europeans from Austria and Germany frequently traveled there, paying enormous sums to be guided safely on expeditions to hunt snow leopards, rare mountain deer, or reach peaks untouched by human feet. My grandfather was originally a passionate and highly skilled hunter in both the Alps and the Tibetan highlands. After surviving war for a cause of freedom, he decided to live life on his own terms and founded his own mountain expedition company. My father and aunt would make difficult winter journeys to visit him, witnessing firsthand how the profit from his ventures funded their comfortable life back in Austria. In his mountain stronghold, he hosted wealthy elites, explorers, politicians, and influential figures. He organized lavish feasts filled with music and celebration after returning from dangerous expeditions. Photographs from that era show him as a lively, joyful man, never overly serious, always full of life. But that golden era ended abruptly when political unrest and armed conflict swept through the region, leading to major geopolitical changes. Many Austrians returned home, and my grandfather was among them. However, according to my father, his return was not simply a homecoming. It marked a tragic transformation. The cheerful, adventurous man disappeared. In his place stood someone withdrawn, harsh, and consumed by darkness. At that time, my father and aunt were already adults and no longer lived in the family home. But they received disturbing news from my grandmother about his deteriorating mental state. He locked himself inside his dark office for days and weeks, sleeping there, eating in isolation. This continued for months as he buried himself in thick, mysterious volumes and old geographical maps. Eventually, he revealed the truth that had been consuming him. A year before his departure, his close partner Klaus had disappeared during an expedition into the Himalayan caves. Due to war and instability, rescue operations collapsed, leaving my grandfather to coordinate desperate search efforts from afar. That helplessness destroyed him. At first, my grandmother avoided asking questions. But over time, it became clear the search was no longer about finding a living man, but perhaps recovering remains. Later, he suddenly became obsessed with a new lead suggesting Klaus might still be alive. He left for Tibet again and spent nearly 10 weeks searching through brutal terrain. My grandmother prayed for him every night. When news arrived that he had failed, she prayed for his strength to accept it. But instead of returning broken, he came back transformed, lost in delusions, unsettling beliefs, and complete isolation from the world. He began importing large quantities of small bronze statues from tribal groups in the eastern passes. I was shocked when I saw how many filled the basement. These were not decorative objects. In local legend, they were known as portable soul coffins. According to belief, if a grain of grave soil is placed inside them, the soul of the deceased becomes trapped within and travels with the statue wherever it goes. My grandfather placed these statues above every door and window in the house. He never explained whether he was trying to imprison something inside, or he also built what he called an ancestral altar in his office corner, placing fresh water and fruit upon it, drawing strange white circular patterns, believing it allowed spirits of the dead to grant him insight. He kept boxes of sacred river stones and ordered the construction of a stone basin in the garden to host water spirits known as Nagas, beings believed to guard nature and separate the world of the living from the dead. Perhaps it was the weight of age that drove him into this obsession, but every fountain and water fixture in the house bore engraved symbols tied to these entities. Yet I am convinced that what truly consumed him was his belief that they could warn him of imminent danger. Thus his final years passed, isolated, trapped in ancient beliefs like a wealthy priest in exile. My grandmother said that at first he only drew symbols around the altar, but as his condition worsened, the symbols began appearing everywhere in the house, growing darker and more frequent. Black markings replaced the protective white circles. In his belief system, black symbols represented opening gateways to the other world. His mental state collapsed alongside his physical health. The sight of crows landing in his garden terrified him, as he believed they were messengers of death. In his final days, he begged my grandmother to bring him what he called a practicing lama, a Tibetan healer, to perform his final rites. My grandmother, though devastated, eventually found an elderly Tibetan woman living near Vienna. She feared her presence would worsen his condition, but the opposite happened. He became calm, almost lucid as she performed her rituals. My grandmother described it as a miracle. Whatever the woman did or said, it removed fear from his heart and granted him peace. A few days later, he passed away. I was in my 20s when he died. Until then, I had been kept away from the truth, told only that he suffered from old age and eccentric behavior. But after his death and my grandmother's inability to maintain the facade, the truth emerged, far more disturbing than I ever imagined. Since then, I have studied his writings and notes, trying to understand what destroyed his mind. But every answer only opens more questions. There are maps, photographs, and shipping records, but not a single clear explanation of what happened to Klaus, or what my grandfather truly witnessed during his 1963 expedition. Understanding what occurred in those mountains feels like the only key to decoding his madness. Yet no rational explanation exists. And in that void, my imagination begins to form horrifying possibilities. My grandfather was once a great man, full of life, But something swallowed his companion in those desolate passes. And I do not believe it was mystery or ignorance that broke him. It was truth. I believe something terrifying, something beyond human comprehension, manifested before him in those mountain jungles. Something the human soul cannot endure. Something that forced him into ancient superstitions and forgotten rituals as his only refuge. And despite all my efforts to find certainty, I sometimes find myself asking in moments of weakness, do I truly want to know the truth? The same truth that completely destroyed my grandfather. Based on a completely reckless decision, I chose to enlist in the French Foreign Legion at the age of 18. I had fallen in with a careless group on the outskirts of my city, and after a horrific car crash that nearly killed all of us while heavily intoxicated, I realized that my current path would only lead to the grave. In truth, the Legion had my father to thank for the idea. He planted it in my mind. He convinced me that I would leave behind a life of chaos, learn discipline, build a strong body, earn a decent salary, and experience real adventure under the roar of gunfire. That was the motivation I needed. I ended up serving as a rapid intervention soldier in what we called the Blue Devils, the nickname of our unit during the late French colonial era in Indochina. At that time, everything revolved around the fear of communism and the threat coming from the north, though history always seems to repeat itself. But suddenly, international alliances shifted, and we found ourselves facing a completely different kind of conflict we were never trained for. We thought things had stabilized. As young soldiers, we believed the rest of our service will be nothing more than peaceful demonstrations and routine duty. But barely a year after the major operations ended, another crisis erupted in Africa, specifically in Namibia. The country had become a burning jungle of hostile tribes fueled by deep-seated hatred, held back only by strict military control. Once that control weakened, hell broke loose. Ethnic massacres, brutal sieges, villages burned to ash. Scenes no human mind should ever have to imagine. International forces intervened under a so-called peace mandate, and we were deployed into a conflict zone known as Okahanja. As the central hub of the region, Okahanja was packed with thousands of civilians. When unrest escalated, it was immediately surrounded by the Red Front militia. The rebels attempted to storm the center, but the defenders' resistance and superior numbers repelled the first assault. In response, the militia imposed a suffocating siege that lasted for years. When we arrived in Okahanja, it felt like a piece of hell on earth. Indiscriminate shelling never stopped. Sniper duels tore through the city. Infrastructure collapsed completely, leaving the air thick with smoke, death, and burning heat. The scene was soul-crushing. It was impossible not to feel sorrow for the innocent people trapped in that bloodied cage. Families were saying goodbye to loved ones every hour. I still remember the moment a single mortar shell struck a church sheltering displaced civilians, killing dozens in seconds. It was a deliberate strike. Snipers were no less cruel. Their bullets made no distinction between armed soldiers and women carrying children. The rule was simple. If you were seen, you were dead. I still cannot forget the image of a rebel sniper shooting a young boy who was running to fetch water. Shelling was terrifying in sound, but because many weapons were outdated, their accuracy was poor. The real horror came from the sniper rifles, precise, silent, and merciless. They could infiltrate behind our lines with ease, and if you crossed their scope, your name was already written in the list of the dead. And that is where this story begins. One autumn morning, my unit was assigned to secure a strategic bridge using 2 armored vehicles. These missions were usually monotonous, but that day was different. Sniper activity was at its peak. While we stayed protected inside our vehicles, civilians, especially the vulnerable, were exposed at every step. Our role was to monitor the horizon, shield civilians with armored cover when fire began, and return fire to force the snipers to withdraw. From our position, we identified 4 fixed sniper locations based on firing angles and bullet calibers. It wasn't exact science, but field experience helped us. Then suddenly, gunfire rained down from an unexpected direction, from the upper floor of an abandoned textile factory. We immediately understood a new shooter had joined the battlefield. But something was off. The shots were wildly inaccurate. At first, we thought he wasn't targeting us. But when the second bullet struck our armored vehicle, we realized we were the intended targets. Our heavy machine gun responded with a barrage of fire, and silence returned. The next day, the same thing happened again. Same factory, same careless shooting. But on the third day, everything changed. The sniper shifted his aim towards civilians. While our vehicle held position, the second armored unit rushed to surround the building. I stayed behind and did not witness the raid, but my comrades later told me the room where the sniper had been hiding showed no signs of trained military presence. The floor was covered with hundreds of spent casings. A small slit in the wooden barrier overlooked our bridge directly. It was an ideal position, even for someone who couldn't shoot properly, which meant hitting any of us had only been a matter of luck and time. The platoon commander then proposed a trap. A reconnaissance team would infiltrate at night and wait inside the building. When the snipers returned, they would be eliminated. At dawn, the operation began. I remained with the armored vehicle while the rest disappeared into the factory's corridors. We waited, tension tightening every nerve. Before noon, the radio crackled in a whisper, movement inside the building. Our blood ran cold. Then gunfire erupted inside the halls. When the noise stopped, we finally exhaled. Everyone was safe. 2 snipers were eliminated, and a third was captured alive. They brought him to us in handcuffs. But before that, they searched the bodies. Cash expensive cigarettes, luxury lighters. Then a green passport, an American passport. They matched the photo to the face. It was him. The dead sniper was not a member of the Red Front militia. He was an American citizen. The captured man carried a bag full of foreign currency, and at first we assumed they were international mercenaries. But after interrogation through a translator, the truth froze our blood. These tourists were not being paid. They were paying enormous sums to the militias, paying for permission to fire at living targets, soldiers or civilians alike. Human safari tourism. Our minds couldn't process the depravity. The prisoner claimed he was only an assistant arranging logistics and never pulled the trigger himself. The wealthy clients had the money and desire to kill, but lacked even basic combat skills. We submitted a detailed report to the base commander, who was as shocked as we were. But all we had was a passport and a testimony. Legally, at that time, there were no clear laws covering this type of tourist combat participation under the rules of war. We considered recovering the bodies for investigation, but mines and rebel activity made it too dangerous. And if the story was true, then perhaps they had already received their own form of justice. The case was officially closed. It remained a military legend for years, until one day I received an email from an old comrade. It was a link to an investigative article titled Paid Death Tours. An American journalist had uncovered evidence of a secret network organizing trips for wealthy sadists to participate in Third World Wars. It was run through transnational criminal organizations, people paying fortunes just for the sick pleasure of hunting human beings. Innocents, passersby, anyone who moved. The report even suggested sniper activity increased during weekends, when they arrived in private jets, played their deadly game, then returned to their luxurious lives. Like a safari trip, except the prey was people like us. The article did not mention how many of them died in those encounters, but considering the intensity of fire we returned, I'm almost certain many of those tourists never made it back from their vacation. Honestly, I feel no sympathy for them, but realizing that this kind of brutality was real, that human beings could turn a living nightmare into a form of entertainment, left a weight in my chest that never went away. Because profiting from war is vile enough, but purchasing a human life, someone you don't know, someone who never harmed you, and then going home as if you had done nothing more than shoot a stray bird, that is something else entirely. About 4 decades ago, specifically during the winter of 1989, I set out with my friend Salim in his old car toward the cedar forest high in the mountains, hoping to hunt a pair of wild deer for a New Year's feast. I still remember that dawn as if it happened only hours ago. I was in my early 20s, 23 to be exact, and Salim was a year older than me. We both worked together at a textile factory on the outskirts of Tetuan, he in the dyeing section, and I in cargo handling. Our income was modest, but it covered our basic needs. Because we worked long rotating shifts, we had enough free time to go hunting whenever the season opened. That year, I had promised my grandmother I would bring back fresh game so she could prepare it for a family dinner. But to save money, we decided to turn a simple outing into a mountain expedition, replacing frozen meat with something we would hunt ourselves. At the time, I owned an old 4-wheel drive Nissan. It looked worn and battered, but it was as tough as stone. After loading our rifles, a cooler box, and some snacks, we left before sunrise, heading deeper into the highlands before the first light broke. We reached the parking point just as dawn began to appear at the end of a rough, rocky track that led into a dense forest. We had hunted there the year before. The hills were covered with juniper and oak trees, which meant natural food for the animals and better meat, with a wild flavor you never get from farm-raised game. We walked slowly, talking quietly, drinking warm tea as birds and animals began their morning calls. After about 2 kilometers, we set up an ambush using wooden covers and mountain brush. I carried a handmade wooden call my uncle had crafted, and for nearly an hour, I mimicked the soft sounds of female deer during mating season. But nothing responded. Only the wind, squirrels, and distant movement of animals breaking the silence. Salim mocked me, saying we would end up shooting a skinny rabbit and calling it a deer when we returned. Then suddenly, we heard the loud cracking of branches behind a nearby hill. And finally, after the long wait in freezing cold that nearly numbed our bodies, a pair of large deer appeared, digging through the snow about 50 meters ahead of us. Our excitement rose instantly as we watched them move slowly, unaware of our presence. We waited and waited even more. Then, at the perfect moment, I raised my rifle and fired. The larger deer dropped immediately. Salim managed to hit the second one, but mine was the more impressive. Large antlers, thick brown coat, a clean kill with a single shot. We shook hands in victory and began the exhausting task of dragging the animals back toward the car. It was brutal work. Afterward, we started cleaning the carcasses on-site to avoid doing it later at home. We were covered in blood and remains, rushing to finish before the day warmed up, since wild meat spoils quickly under the sun. Salim kept complaining, saying this made him miss the factory and that fishing would have been easier than cutting through tough hides. I laughed and turned to tease him about his taste in food, but I never finished the sentence. Before I could speak, a bullet cut through the air above us. A sharp gunshot echoed across the mountain. I think a large rock behind us stopped the round, but I can't be sure. All I heard was a metallic impact. We froze in shock. I couldn't understand why anyone would shoot at us, and I assumed it was another hunter's mistake. I shouted, "Stop! There are people here. Watch your aim." Silence followed. No apology. No response. Only the wind moving through bare trees. Then a second shot exploded, much closer this time, blasting the ground just centimeters from Salim's foot. We screamed and dove toward the car for cover. I thought about grabbing my rifle near a tree, but I realized even a single exposed movement could get us killed. Our only option was to stay low and pray the shooter had no angle on us. We quickly realized the attacker was not behind us, but across the road, watching from another side. We could only look at the car's side mirror, hoping to catch a flash if he fired again. In a desperate move, Salim tried crawling under the car, but I pulled him back just as another bullet struck the exact spot he had been aiming for. Then he reached for his weapon from the back seat while I trembled, fearing he would be shot at any second. But he managed to retrieve it safely. That gave us a faint hope. Maybe the shooter had left. After what felt like hours, we decided to run. We jumped into the car, abandoning everything. The deer, the skins, everything behind us. I didn't even think about my precious rifle. Survival mattered more. I leaned low in the driver's seat, started the engine, and sped off. The tires screamed against the gravel, and we didn't even close the doors properly. I expected the windshield to shatter at any second or bullets to tear through the car, but nothing came. Only the roar of the engine as we escaped down the mountain path. We only calmed down once we reached the paved road. Even then, it took miles before our heartbeat slowed. We went straight to the gendarmerie station in complete shock, only then realizing our clothes were soaked in blood. One of the officers later joked that he thought we had committed a massacre and only relaxed when he learned it was animal blood. After cleaning ourselves, we told them everything. It felt like a surreal nightmare. They took detailed statements and asked about the exact location. Leaving the animals behind turned out to be a good decision. It helped them identify the exact site. The officer said they would send a patrol, assuming it was either a prank or a stray bullet. But for us, the attack had been direct and intentional. We trusted the investigation, and the truth eventually came out, but only years later. After that day, we sat in a small cafe in silence, drinking tea. Salim convinced me not to go back for my rifle. And he was right, because when the authorities later went to the site, they found half-clean carcasses, but no rifle. That realization settled deep fear inside us. The shooter hadn't left in panic. He hadn't run out of bullets. He had watched us escape like prey, then calmly stepped out of hiding and took my rifle as a trophy. That moment killed my passion for hunting forever, and we didn't understand how close we had come to something far worse until 10 years later. One summer, a man named Omar al-Jabali was arrested for a series of murders in remote forests. The headlines spread everywhere, but what shocked us wasn't the number of victims. It was his method. He didn't confront them. He didn't rob them. He hunted them from extreme distances, like a human hunter. Salim was the one who called me. I still remember the knot in my throat as I held the phone, realizing we had once stood under the sight of a sadistic serial killer. We had been seconds away from becoming just another entry in his list. And what made it even more horrifying was that only days after we survived, he killed someone in almost the same exact area. Later, evidence connected him to other unresolved cases, and innocent people had even been imprisoned for years because of crimes he committed before the truth came out. Even today, I wonder how a human being could enjoy destroying so many lives, people he never even knew, and how, by mercy alone, we were not among his victims. I grew up in an isolated mountain village high in the Abruzzo region of Italy during the late 1950s and early 1960s. Life there was extremely simple, yet wrapped in the harshness of survival, as was the case in many forgotten rural villages across Europe at the time. Poverty was etched into the homes, and yet family bonds were as strong as the roots of ancient trees. Religious tradition and ritual were an inseparable part of daily life, to the point that talk of the church and sermons would weave through every gathering. Most of the locals relied entirely on hard labor to secure food. Many grew vegetables in their small home courtyards and fermented local drinks in damp cellars. Meat, however, was a rare luxury. If a family could not afford to buy it, the only alternative was to venture deep into the rugged forest to hunt. Hunting there was never a pastime. It was a survival strategy, a sacred inheritance passed down from grandparents to grandchildren. In that region, hunting held a status comparable to the passion major cities had for horse racing. It was considered part of the community's identity. This tradition dated back to times of great hardship, when generations learned that the forest was not for leisure, but a storehouse of sustenance. It was common for young boys to accompany their fathers on deer tracking trips, an experience seen as a rite of passage into manhood. From an early age, we were taught strict safety rules in the wilderness, such as wearing a bright red scarf, so that another hunter would not mistake you for prey and shoot accidentally. There was also deep respect for the men who risked their lives in the forest to provide food for others, because a single deer was enough to fill tables with meat for weeks during the harsh winter. For this reason, when two of the village's most skilled hunters disappeared while I was 12 years old, the news struck like a shockwave that shook the entire community. The two men were named Enzo and Paolo, inseparable companions on every hunting trip, known to both young and old in the village. At first, some people jokingly called them the Shadows because they were always seen together, but that humor vanished completely the moment they went missing. No one dared make jokes afterward. Instead, they were referred to with heavy hearts as the missing hunters. Large-scale search operations were launched, involving men from surrounding villages in coordination with the gendarmerie. Hills and deep valleys near an area known as the Pass of Silence were combed repeatedly, but the land yielded nothing. No torn clothing, no abandoned equipment, nothing at all. During that time, church bells rang in prayer for them at every service, and everyone prayed for their safe return. At first, there was a fragile hope that they had simply lost their way in the fog or been injured and would eventually come back. But as seasons passed, that hope slowly withered, and people began to accept the idea that they were almost certainly gone. What made the situation even more disturbing was the absence of any sign of foul play or animal attack, which deepened the mystery. With no traces of struggle and no bodies found, some people began to believe they had left the village willingly, as if they had simply vanished without warning. As years went by, the village gradually grew accustomed to that emptiness, as if it had become part of its fate. Then, suddenly, a marble memorial appeared in front of the church. Later, I saw their wives wearing black scars at public gatherings, as if grief had finally taken its permanent, definitive form. Eventually, after many years, they were officially declared dead for legal and inheritance purposes. But this was not just an administrative decision. It felt like the final door closing on any remaining hope in people's hearts. Once the village accepted their legal death, a different kind of grief erupted. It was not the earlier sorrow mixed with expectation, but something far more bitter, because hope had now died completely. The deepest impact was on the children. Enzo and Paolo left behind 2 wives and 7 children who suddenly became orphans overnight. It was heartbreaking to watch these children grow up with loss carved into their faces especially after years of holding onto the fantasy that their fathers would return with hunting trophies. Over time, grief turned into silent anger. People were no longer satisfied with mourning. They began searching for someone to blame. During a public gathering, one man accused the search teams of negligence, and tensions exploded, with accusations spreading among the villagers. During that period, my father sank into his own despair over what had happened. I remember him sitting on the balcony at night, drinking bitterly, muttering that something crucial was missing from the story. He was convinced they had not been lost in the forest at all, but rather taken in an unknown vehicle toward an uncertain fate far beyond the mountains. At the same time, darker explanations spread among the villagers, suggestions that they had been forced to leave or had fallen victim to an old vendetta. My father, however, believed that hunters as strong-willed as Enzo and Paolo would never abandon their families without leaving even a single sign behind. Years passed, and the mystery remained unsolved. Then one day, a police officer visited their families and began asking strange questions about past dealings with farm owners in a distant province. The Wise had no idea what he was referring to. Later, news leaked that authorities were cooperating with neighboring jurisdictions, where a remote pig farm had been excavated based on an anonymous tip, searching for something allegedly buried deep underground. The news spread rapidly. Some curious villagers went to see for themselves and found police digging intensely with shovels and excavators, as if chasing something they believed was unquestionably there beneath the soil. However, no clear discovery was announced in the early days, which once again fueled public outrage. People demanded answers. Why the excavation? Who made the anonymous tip? Why all the secrecy? After weeks of speculation, officials finally stated that the tip had been unreliable and that the excavation yielded nothing. But few believed it, as they could not accept that such a massive operation had been carried out without solid grounds. In the end, the investigation was officially closed. There were no further leads, and no trace of Enzo or Paolo was ever found, neither alive nor dead. And so, their disappearance remained a towering mystery that cast a shadow over the village for many years. Even after I left those mountains, I do not believe that mystery ever truly faded. On the contrary, I am certain it still lingers there, like a heavy shadow over the memory of the place and its people.